There's all kinds of steps, that we can take to improve education of our kids right now, today. Parent power is the answer. Parents need to control the content and the methods by which their children are taught, not the government.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Franklin podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Andrew Bernstein. Andrew is a professor of philosophy at Marist College. He's taught at a variety of universities in the New York area. And he's the author of a book called Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Write or Understand Math and What We Can Do About It. The book is a play on the title of Rudolf Fleisch's 1950s book, Why Johnny Can't Read, which was an expose on the growing literacy crisis in America. Spoiler alert, it hasn't gotten better, hence Andrew's follow-up text nearly 70 years later, still commenting on the same problem. In the book, Andrew talks about the history of American decline in both literacy rates and mathematical abilities. He talks about the decline of quality in public education, and he talks about some of the movements that are most promising for fixing American literacy rates and delivering stronger educations to our kids. In today's episode, Andrew and I talk about the book. We talk about some of the biggest contributing factors to why American students struggle so badly with reading. We talk about some of the biggest things that he's seen as a college professor in terms of the gaps in knowledge, both in terms of literacy, American history, civics, geography, that he sees in the students coming into his university level classrooms. And we talk about some of the things that he's most optimistic about in terms of the future of education and his top advice for parents on raising kids who not only know how to read, but enjoy it and do it often. This was a really interesting interview, and I hope you enjoy listening. Andrew Bernstein, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. Thanks for having me back on.
It is my delight to have you here. There's a couple reasons why this is really timely. One is I was just talking about your book a couple weeks ago when I was sharing book recommendations for parents, which is how this interview came to be. But two, yes, Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Write or Understand Math and What We Can Do About It. I love that there's a problem and a solution in this book title. It's yes. Naming a big problem, but it's optimistic, which is very much the vibes around here.
Yes.
But also this is really timely because I've been talking about the decline of academic standards on Twitter this past week, and it's been getting a lot of traction. I've had a couple tweets go pretty viral. And I think maybe that's a good place for us to start our conversation today, because I want to get your takes on these. I posted a tweet, I think over the weekend, and it's at the tail end of its acceleration curve of momentum, but it's still, every time I open Twitter, my notifications are still full of likes and comments. It's a picture of a 8th grade exam from 1912. And my commentary on it was very simple. It was basically, you don't see any word problems around how many watermelons you could fit in Stacy's station wagon on here. It's much more practical how to calculate things like interest, and practical civics questions and grammatical questions, with the intention of an 8th grade education being preparation for an adult life, because the average student stopped school by 8th grade. And this thing exploded. People found it very interesting. Lots and lots of comments about the decline of our education system. In your book, you talk about the decline of American education and the decline of academic standards in American education. And this is where I want to start our conversation, because apparently this is really timely. Apparently this is a thing that people find interesting and are talking about. What happened over the past 100 years? Why have education standards in America fallen so dramatically?
And that's a really good question, Hannah. I think before we answer the question, I think we should point out just how high, there's good news here in the past, because we can then replicate it again in the future, just how high American literacy levels were and educational standards were throughout the colonial period, the revolutionary period, the early 19th century. There's a lot of proxy data, showing that. My favorite is that the essays of the Federalist which are very sophisticated essays in political philosophy, were written largely as newspaper editorials for every man and every woman to read. So I mean that shows the college graduates today very often would struggle with those essays. So the American education standards in the past, prior to the 20th century, you're right, that's the turning point, were very high. And then what happened was, I mean, the key point was progressive, so-called progressive education. John Dewey, William Hurd Kilpatrick, people like that. And a long time ago, Hannah, the great Chinese philosopher Confucius said, "The beginning of wisdom is to see to it that things are called by their right names." There's nothing progressive about progressives, whether it's in politics. Socialism is not progressive, and this animus towards academic training is not progressive either. They're the regressives, but they're known as the progressives. But anyhow, their main point around the time of World War I was they thought that academic education, was meant for the best and the brightest, for the elite. A lot of your audience probably knows a little bit about the history of philosophy. They know Plato's Republic. The ideal has long been, the conceit has long been for the philosopher king, namely that society should be governed by the educated intellectual elite. And the rest of us, we don't need that much education. We should just, get a modicum of education and get vocational training, be good at our jobs, whether butcher, baker, candlestick maker, or farmer, and then obey the wise rulers of the state. And that's what happened early 20th century. IQ testing had just come in. Lewis Terman at Stanford, developed the Stanford Binet, and others developed various IQ tests. The progressives wanted to and did IQ test the kids. You look for the best and the brightest. They get the full academic program, math, literature, science, history, and they go on to govern both in the legislature and in the classroom. And the rest of us get a little bit of academic training, but we get more vocational training. Like I said, the goal then is to for us to be good at our jobs and obey the wise rulers of the state. And that was the beginning of it. And it snowballed from there, got worse, but that was the beginning of it. And that the key, as always, is reading. Reading is the fundamental cognitive skill. If a child learns how to read well, that's not hard if you use phonics. If a child learns to read well, the whole world of knowledge is open to him. And not surprisingly, the progressives, they were opposed to phonics. They wanted to use look-say or some variation on the whole word method, which is an abysmal failure. And reading scores in the United States started to plummet. So that's the beginning of it all, roughly time of World War I.
Can we talk for a minute about the relationship between the importance of reading and the importance of mathematical skills? Because those two things are, the three R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, have long been considered the most important underpinnings, the building blocks of knowledge. Are they, in your mind, equally important? Because you just said reading is the key to everything, and I want to break this down a little bit. Are they equally important, or is reading more important than mathematics? Does reading beget the ability to unlock mathematics? How do you think about these two things?
They're all important, but not all important things are equally important. They're all important because they're basic thinking skills. The ability to read, the ability to write a coherent sentence, paragraph, and later on college level essay, and certainly the ability to do basic mathematical calculation. They're all thinking skills. I do think reading is the most fundamental and the most important because, like I said, if a child is a strong reader, an adult is a strong reader, the whole world of knowledge is then open to that person, and that way you strongly encourage somebody to be a lifelong learner. So I think reading is the most. If I had to focus as a parent or as a teacher on only one fundamental skill, I would do reading, phonics, which is what Marva Collins did. The great Marva Collins did at West Side Prep. She even had the kids sound out the words in the math textbook. It was reading is fundamental. And all of us need it. Not everybody needs strong mathematical skills. I mean, we're not going to be engineers, but we all need to be able to read. That is fundamental to having a successful human life.
You talked about the literacy skills in early America, which is something I've talked about on the show before too, because it is striking the difference between pre nationalized education literacy rates and post nationalized education literacy rates. It's not as dramatic a shift in the upwards direction as people assume it would be. You mentioned the Federalist Papers, and I think there's a couple things that I want to get into here as a litmus test of you mentioned the Federalist Papers as a litmus test of the ability to read measured by what is being popularly circulated. And there's a couple pieces here that I want to get into. One is I'm curious to dig a little bit into the evolution of language as devil's advocate to this for a moment. I agree with your argument that this is ample evidence that we used to be able to read at a cognitive level that we can no longer muster. But if you go back and you read something like Shakespeare, the language has evolved since the writing of Shakespeare to a point where the structure of the sentences at times is entirely different. The words used are antiquated, things they've been replaced over time with new ways of speaking. Language is a living thing, it evolves over time.
Mhm.
An argument could be made that the same thing has happened since the writing of the Federalist Papers. Well, the way we just communicate with each other in mass publication has shifted, but that's not necessarily better or worse. I'm curious what your response to that would be and what your argument would be for this being a timeless litmus test. Obviously, there are words being used in the Federalist Papers that are not antiquated. They are still part of the language. People just don't know how to sound them out anymore. But I'm curious how you would describe both the change of popular culture and language and the change of literacy and the relationship between those two things.
Well, I mean, I think there's a point there, although I think it's a secondary one. But I was trying to read Chaucer recently, the Canterbury Tales, and I certainly couldn't read the medieval English. I used the No Fear edition and read the modern English. So there's certainly a point there. But let's test it. Let's test it, everybody. Give them a copy of the Fountainhead, Ayn Rand's great novel, written in the 20th century, my all-time favorite book. The language is not antiquated. Let's see how they do with it. And or some, maybe the Fountainhead is too sophisticated. It's at too high a level. Take some 20th century novelist who is very good, right? John Steinbeck, let's say, Mice and Men, or one of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Take or Hemingway, who's basically simple to read. He's not Faulkner. We'll take Old Man and the Sea, and let's see how everybody does with it. How they do with the mechanics of reading it, and how they do with reading comprehension. And I think we're going to see, in a lot of cases, people are going to struggle. Even with something relative, even with Hemingway, who likes to use, small words. He criticized Faulkner for the obtuseness of Faulkner's writing style. Hemingway is relatively simple. I think a lot of Americans are going to struggle even with the Old Man and the Sea.
Compared to modern language, it's not simple. Compared to like the average things that a student is reading in a textbook, Hemingway isn't as simple as it's made out to be compared to what's being published today.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm guessing I've looked at the high school reading lists, and the reading levels for high schools, often the books are at fifth grade or sixth grade level for high school kids. So yeah, compared to that, Hemingway seems like Kant or Hegel, was almost impenetrable. But that itself is an indicator of how the reading levels have declined. If you have high school kids reading at a fifth or sixth grade level, and I've seen some of these horror stories from Project Baltimore, that some of the kids in high school are reading at a first grade level, and the high school students, it's just heartbreaking. And the school system has simply failed them. And I don't, we can argue against the school system a lot, and we should. I just want to point out, though, there's still a lot of good classroom teachers in the public school system, who are dedicated, who care about the kids' education, who realize, that the kids need phonics to learn how to read, and have they had to fight against the stifling bureaucracy in order to like smuggle it into their classrooms. There's still a lot of good classroom teachers, but the bureaucracy opposes academic training, and we see the results. I mean, I teach college, and I got, Hannah, my students are overwhelmingly really good kids, and I really like them. They're really good American kids, but they don't know a damn thing about American history. They replaced history more than 100 years ago with social studies. Some of them struggle with the mechanics of reading, have them reading primary sources in philosophy, very difficult, which at college level, they should be able to do. But the ignorance of American history, I mean, I had one college class right before the pandemic, 20 students in the class, all American kids, all born, reared here, educated in American schools. Not one out of 20 knew that James Madison was the lead author of the U.S. Constitution and virtually the sole author of the Bill of Rights. Not 1 out of 20. 10 out of 20, fully half of them never heard of him. The other 10 knew he was president of the United States. But nobody knew he was the author of the Constitution. Nobody. That's how little. And I think that's indicative. It's representative of how little American history is taught in the schools today. And often when they do teach American history, they're using textbooks by people like Howard Zinn, which depict the United States as a racist, evil empire. So it's very bad.
Can you share more anecdotes of some of the things that you've seen inside the classroom that have been surprising in terms of gaps in knowledge? I'm sure you have loads of them.
Yeah, nothing surprises me anymore, but they used to surprise me. I remember one kid on a final exam. I'm reading this, and she's writing, this is loosely that, and she used the word a couple of times, loosely, L-O-O-S-H-L-Y, loosely this or loosely that. And I'm thinking, what is it all right to use any cuss words on your show, Hannah? Like, what the hell is this? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So,
yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
And what the hell is this? And I finally, I showed it to, I was married at the time. I showed it to my wife, and, we went through it together. And she was one of the guys, she said, the student means usually. The kid thought that usually was spelled loosely. Now, that's a very loose spelling of usually, L-O-O-S-H-L-Y. But yeah, the spelling is often atrocious. Spiotat was another one. This kid was writing. How did he spell it? This was just like years ago. S-P-E-O-R-T-A-T, Spiotat, came up a few times. And I finally realized he meant separate. That's how he spelled separate. So, yeah, there's one, when was that? About 4 or 5 years ago, I started a podcast known as The Education Guy. When my daughter was still in high school, and I went around and and spoke to a lot of different people. So I'm teaching a class. I won't mention the school or the kids' names. I said, anybody, I do a podcast. Anybody after class want to come on the podcast and talk about your educational experience? I said, you don't have to name names. We're not looking to embarrass anybody. You don't want to name names. And there was this kid in class. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. I still remember him. Big dude, he's like 6'5", 250 pounds. Looked like a football player, which he might have been. Also very smart. And he says to me, I'll come on the show. He said, I want to name names. I said, okay. And he came on the show. He named the name of the high school, the town, the principal, the English teachers. He named them all. He said, in high school, the English teacher had us making paper airplanes and stuff. We weren't reading anything. And this is not so uncommon. I'll give you one last example. My daughter is now in grad school, but at Parsons Institute down in New York City. But when I started writing this book, she was a high school senior at a Tony upscale suburban public high school in Westchester County, New York, very wealthy area. And so, what did they read? She was in 12th grade. So, what did they read that year? I asked her, and I wrote it, in the book to give some background. When I was in high school, 1960s, Brooklyn, New York. People hear me talk, they don't think I'm from Brooklyn. They think I'm from Louisiana, but they're wrong. That's a joke, by the way. You're supposed to laugh. But, yeah, I was such a troublemaker. They kicked me out of all the advanced placement classes, all the honors and honors background classes. So here I am in 12th grade, garden variety English class, Brooklyn, New York, late 1960s. And I remember two things about that, a few things about that class. I remember we read Macbeth, and I remember we read Crime and Punishment. And then we wrote papers on it, and the teacher worked with us on our writing. Well, fast forward all these years, my daughter's in this, upscale high school, and what did they read? 12th grade? Yet is nothing. They read nothing. They spent the whole entire year working on their college essays. Now, at least that has a little benefit, improving their writing has practical, impact. But a whole year of high school goes by without any familiarity for these kids with the world's great literature. Now, that is a crime. And Richard Pipes, a scholar at Harvard, passed away subsequently, but he said at Harvard that the students in his freshman humanities course were woefully unacquainted with the world's great literature. It was at Harvard.
Wow.
So, yeah, and as I pointed out in the book, if the schools had been doing their job from day one, you start off in elementary school and you have the kids read, I think, should read, children's books, great children's books, The Secret Garden, Peter Pan, Anne of Green Gables. There's a lot of great children's books. And then you'll write paragraphs about it. You can't expect 6, 7-year-old kids to write an essay, and you gradually increase the sophistication of the books as they grow older, and by the time they're in middle school, I think they can be writing essays, and you work with them on it. By the time you get to be 12th grade, in high school, how much work do the kids even need at that point on their college essays? They've been writing essays, since they were, 11, 12 years old. Now they're 17 or 18. So, no, the schools haven't done their job. And I mean, for me, literature was always my first love. And so, as an English major in college, and, still, what do I read mostly? I'm reading, great works of fiction generally. And these kids aren't getting the background in literature. Now, that makes it hard for me as a philosophy professor, because philosophy is hard, as you know. It deals with these very abstract principles. What's the nature of the universe taken as a whole? As a totality, it's a very abstract question. And it would really help if these kids had a strong background in the humanities, in history and literature, in reading and writing skills, and they don't. And it makes my job much more difficult to teach them philosophy. You get into moral philosophy, maybe the most important questions of all, about what does it mean to be a good person. And so it'd be great if they knew something about literature, and I could reference some of Shakespeare's characters or Dostoevsky's characters. It would be great, but they don't, so I can't.
I think I would argue there are a lot of factors at play here, and we'll get into some of the systemic factors that are contributing to this. But I would argue that there's also a cultural component, because kids mirror the behavior of the adults around them until they hit puberty, and then sometimes they want to rebel against the behaviors of the adults around them. But for much of their childhoods, they are looking to the adults in the room and in their lives as role models of how to do this whole human thing. And they're hardwired to mirror the behaviors of the adults around them, because that's how, by play acting and copying and mimicking what the adults are doing, that's how they prepare themselves to be an adult too. If children are raised in a house that's full of books and with parents who are actively reading, they're much more inclined to read than children who are never looking at a role model who's consuming literature at all, let alone great literature. And what you said about starting the kids young, reading classics and then writing a paragraph about them, kids don't have a role model for that behavior besides a teacher in the classroom enforcing that behavior coercively, if at all. That's the only role model they have of reading and then writing. And the act of consuming ideas and then writing about them is how you develop your own capacity to think. But they're never seeing that, because adults in our culture aren't embodying this behavior either. There are so many historic examples of people doing this as part of their path towards success in life. You know, Frederick Douglass is one of the most inspiring examples because he
Hmm.
came from a world where he wasn't allowed to read at all. And then he read and wrote copiously throughout his life and
Right.
had a very large impact on the trajectory of American culture and history. But I've always been struck by how many of the people that I admire in the world are copious readers. So many of the founders and the inventors, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, obviously all of the great thinkers, the podcasters, everybody's reading a lot because it's how you develop yourself and your ability to do something beyond just what you're told. And yet in you have to go out and seek out these role models culturally. It's not baked into the popular culture at all, and it's certainly not baked into the average home. And so I would argue that there's a component to this where, as a culture, we've lost our respect for reading, or we think of it as sort of a noble thing, like, I don't know, doing a paleo diet, but nobody's actually going to do it because it's hard. Or lifting heavy weights, like most people aren't actually lifting super heavy weights because it's uncomfortable. We sort of admire it in the abstract, but most people aren't doing it. And I think we kind of think of reading as the same in the same sense. But I think there's a broad cultural problem where reading isn't a thing that kids even see enough to mirror. They only associate it with coercively being told to do something that they don't really want to do in a classroom environment that's already kind of making them miserable. But I'm curious to dig into, I mean, well, if you have thoughts about that, we can dive into that too. But I'm also curious to get into a little bit of the progression of this in a bit more detail, because you were talking about, you know, back in revolutionary era America, the literacy rates were quite high, and not only the ability to read, but the cognitive capacity at which one could read. So we have a history of reading, and somehow we've lost both the capacity for it and the reverence for it. And I want to get a little bit more into the weeds of how this happened and the progression of events, because you'd think if we had a culture of doing this thing that's beneficial for us, we'd keep doing it, right? So
Hmm.
something had to have happened.
Well, that's a good point, Hannah. Before I have at least one, I think, important thought in answer to the question. But before I even get to that, I think parents do need to step up here, and read themselves and serve as a role model for their children. But one thing they can do, even if they're not avid readers themselves, presumably they can at least read, but and that is, it's very simple to teach your child to read is in two steps. When my daughter was very young, she's 2 years old, we go out and we go to the park and we play and we do all kinds of fun things. And part of the fun day was we go to the bookstore. Borders was still in business back then. But we go to Borders, or today we could go to Barnes and Noble or the library, go to the children's section, and say, pick out a book. And Penny, my daughter, was always a very careful shopper. Just take an hour, literally an hour, to pick out the book she wanted. Well, I just let her, because the first important point here is let the child pick out the book at 2 or however old she is or he is, because the purpose here is to show the child that books are fun, that reading is fun. And she'd get a book she wanted at 2 years old. Is usually some, goofy story about a dog who could fly, or a kitten who thought the full moon was a bowl of milk. But whatever, at 2 years old, she enjoyed that. And she'd sit down on the floor, and she'd pat the floor next to her, and she said to me, "Sit down, Daddy, and read to me." So I did. And she found out that books were fun. And then once the child knows that, she motivated, or he, depending, boy or girl, but whatever, the child's motivated to want to learn how to read and not depend on mommy, daddy, or the teacher to read to him. And then you use systematic phonics. And you could do that by age 4 for most kids, 5 at the latest. Systematic phonics, you not only teach the child the sound of the letters, but the sound of the combination of letters. And then you could sound out something like 87% of words in the English language, even in English, which is an irregular language, and they're well on their way to being good readers. All parents who could at least read, a little bit, can do that for their kids. And I think Dewey and William Hurt Kilpatrick at Columbia University Teachers College and their ilk did their job effectively, Hannah. They don't want American people to read well. And so when they eliminated phonics or warred against it for look say or some version of the whole word method, they made reading much more difficult than it has to be. It made it painful, like you said before. It's like lifting weights. My motto on weightlifting, even when I was a basketball player, my motto on weightlifting was no pain, no pain. Um, and reading's become tortuously difficult if you're not taught to sound out the words, sound out the letters. Reading becomes very difficult. And I can understand why more and more people in the country today don't read. It's painful. It's hard. It's difficult for them. Whereas if they've been taught to sound out the letters, reading's no more difficult for a child to learn to do well than to ride a bike or learn how to swim for a healthy, for somebody, who's got a healthy brain. And so I think that's one reason why, a lot of the adults don't, maybe a main reason why a lot of the adults don't read. It's a painful process. I'll give you one example. I'm teaching, I don't want to mention the school's name, but it's considered a good college in the New York suburbs. Really good kids. And I was teaching a course I made up. What was it? Philosophic themes in great literature. I use great literary works to teach, moral and philosophic principles. And so we were reading, some really good works. We're reading Antigone, Sophocles, great play. We were reading Shakespeare's King Lear, reading Ayn Rand's Anthem. We were reading some really good stuff. And I made the mistake early in the semester of having the kids. These are it's an upper division course, and a cross listed between the English and the philosophy department. So these are 21, 22-year-old college juniors and seniors. I figured safe to have them read aloud. Not so safe as it turned out. And I realized right away, and I was naive. I thought this was 2006 maybe, because I thought by that time phonics had made a comeback. So the kids are reading, several of them, they're reading, decent students, they're reading, and they get to a word they don't know. And I knew, and they stop. And I knew that kids who were trained to read by phonics would try to sound it out. But the kids who weren't trained with phonics, and in some cases weren't even permitted to try to sound it out, they stop because they're unfamiliar with the shape of the word, and they can't figure it out from the context what this word is. They haven't seen it before. They don't know the shape of it. They stop. And I realized, holy bleep, these kids were trained to read by some version of the whole word method, the method where you're supposed to, memorize the shape of the words, and then, if you don't recognize this new word, because there's thousands of words in the language, you don't recognize the shape of this new word, you guess. You try, in the context, you try and guess, what the word is. And so they stop. They didn't know the word. They didn't try to sound it out. And I realized the schools are still using some variation on the whole word method, and they're still militating against phonics. I stopped. At that point, I stopped asking the kids to read aloud in class. It was embarrassing. If something had to be read, I read it myself.
It's funny because kids who read with phonics, and this is especially true, I think, of homeschoolers who read to themselves a lot and aren't reading in a classroom. You could tell when a kid reads a lot but doesn't often read out loud because they will read something out loud and they'll mispronounce a word, and it's mispronounced phonetically, like it's mispronounced the way it looks, not the way that it properly sounds. And oh, that's somebody who reads a lot and recognizes the word, and they're not sitting there trying to sound it out. They'll just say it. They recognize the word. They've seen it before. They understand what it means in context, but they don't know the pronunciation. And they're saying it based on how they sounded it out the first time they ever saw it. So they're using context clues to help understand meaning if they haven't gone and looked up in the dictionary. But they're getting generally the gist of the sounds correct. They just aren't quite pronouncing it properly because the English language is very strange and things often don't sound the way that they look like they ought to. But they're able to get an approximation of the word
Yeah, right.
because they have the tools of phonics instead of having no idea what the word means and just having to stop because they have no idea what it sounds like because they don't know how to decode it. Very strange.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if the kids can have been trained to sound out the words, I think 87% of the words in the English language roughly are phonetic. So they have the strong foundation if you're reading. The other 13%, like you said, they can figure it out as they go along. So the word, I think examples I use in the book, a word like rough. It's rough should be RUFF if it was phonetic, but it isn't. And a kid who's taught to read by phonics and they come across that word for the first time, they would try to pronounce it roog or rouge, or something. They would, and then you tell them, no, honey, that's rough, and that's how you spell the word rough, which they know the word verbally, and then they learn how to pronounce, how to read these irregularly spelled words, but they have the foundation. Almost 90% of the language is already open to them. So, phonics is the tried and true method. It works. There's no question about it at this point. And good old Rudolph Flesch made a very strong case back in 1955, right? And why Johnny can't read. Good for him. It helped bring about a resurgence of phonics in the country. We'd be in worse shape, reading if it wasn't for Flesch's book becoming a bestseller.
We'd be in worse shape, which is a scary thing to think about because
Yeah.
the shape is already pretty rough. It's already pretty bad out there.
Yeah.
Um, did you mentioned some stats in your answer, that statistics around the number of students who can can read whole word versus phonics? Did I hear you correctly?
I mean, there has been a lot of research on this, and I think the conclusion has always been that kids learn to read faster and more effectively using phonics than using any other method. And I think a lot of kids who are trained with whole word method, with look-say or whatever, they learn to read to the extent that they do, despite the method. Their parents might show them how to sound out the word, or they figure it out themselves as they become adults, and they learn how to sound out the words. But if you literally try to use the whole word method, you got to memorize the shape of the word. How many tens of thousands of words are there in the English language, Hannah? I don't
Yeah.
even know, but it's tens of thousands. Nobody, not the greatest literary geniuses of history, not Shakespeare, nobody could do that, could memorize all the words in the English language. If you literally stuck to that method, you would be you'd be stuck at the level of the Dick and Jane, readers. See
Well, it's
spot run.
crazy because we have this language that has this intricate code, this very intricate but also beautifully simple code. There's 26 letters in the alphabet, and you can rearrange them to make any word you want. It's such advanced technology, and yet we're reducing it back down to being hieroglyphs again.
Exactly. So it's called the Roman alphabet, right? As I recall, that whatever the name is, it's one of the greatest achievements of the human intellect ever. You're absolutely right. 26 letters, 40 some odd sounds. That's it. And a child could learn that, especially somebody who's around parents who speak to him or her a lot and already has, by age 4, has a vocabulary of several thousand words. You could learn how to, this coding method, this decoding method, you can learn it in a matter of weeks, months at the most. And then the whole world of reading is open to the kid. Whereas look-say, or any version of the whole word method is tortuously difficult because you cannot possibly, the greatest genius could not memorize all the shape of the words in the language. And like I said, I'm old enough, and when I was in grammar school, they were still using the Dick and Jane readers. I don't know if you've probably seen them, Hannah, right? And it's so simple-minded. It's really kind of pathetic. See spot, run, come home, spot, come home. I mean, that's the level of the vocabulary. And if kids are taught to read phonetically, they could read much more sophisticated children's books at that age. That's first grade, but they're 6 by that time. They could be reading, The Secret Garden, at that age, which is a really good story, with a much more, advanced vocabulary. But on the look-say method, the whole word method, you can't. You gotta stick to this pablum and introduce a few new small words every year, and it's heartbreaking. It makes the learning of reading tortuously difficult when it should be a very simple thing. Most important point is the one you make: 26 letters, 40 some odd sounds. Is very simple. The whole world of knowledge is then open to you. All you got
Beautiful
to do is
technology.
exactly. All you got to do is remember how to pronounce these letters and these combinations of letters.
Yeah, it's so simple. It's amazing. Um, where did the look-say method enter into common teaching practice? Because I assume with the era that you're talking about as a case study of strong literacy rates in America, Revolutionary War era American post-war, where I presume that in that time everyone was learning phonics.
Mm-hmm.
Where did the look-say method become recommended practice, and why?
If I remember correctly, I mentioned Rudolf Flesch before, and in case people don't know him, he was a Austrian immigrant to the United States around had a PhD he had a law degree, I think, from the University of Vienna, and then got a PhD in library science at Columbia. And this is 1950s, he realized, he points out in his great book, Why Johnny Can't Read, there were no remedial reading problems anywhere in Europe, because in all these European nations, they teach children to read using phonics. And he did the research, and he said there were no remedial reading problems in the United States until roughly 1920. For the same reason, the American people were using phonics. Now, if I remember correctly, and I think Flesch talks about the genesis and the origin of the look-say method, and I think it goes back to the 18th century, but most people didn't use it, like you said. And I think the McGuffey's readers that so many American kids would learn to read from, which were much more advanced than any primers that we have today. I think the McGuffey's readers were set up so that they could be used from either phonetic training or look-say training. But what you said is exactly right. The overwhelming number of American parents and teachers were using phonics, and the militant hostility towards phonics is a matter of the progressives in the early 20th century. And I think one of it comes from Teachers College at Columbia. Arthur Gates, was that the professor's name, who wrote, in 1920s, was writing on how we need to phase out the use of phonics and use, some variation on the whole word method. It comes from the Columbia University Teachers College. Now, Dewey wasn't in Teachers College. He was in the philosophy department at Columbia, but he had exerted a big influence on Teachers College, which was the #1 teacher training institute in the country at that time, and it's still very, very prominent. When I was interviewed last month by Dennis Prager points out, he thinks, Columbia was the first and probably still the worst, regarding teacher training, and I think that's still true. Dewey has some great quotes from Dewey. Why he didn't want the kids at an early age to learn how to read. The reason being, so they militated against phonics, Hannah, not because it didn't work well, but because it worked too well. They don't want the kids to read because that makes them independent. They wanted Dewey. William Hurt Kilpatrick ran the philosophy of education department at Columbia Teachers College, and he considered himself Dewey's leading disciple. He was the one who introduced the project method. That was enormously influential. You want the kids working in groups because you want them to learn how to haggle, argue, get along with the group. If necessary, give up their own judgment to go, to conform to the group. Learn how to cooperate, with the group. Conform socially so that they'll obey the wise rules of the state. He didn't want the kids sitting at the desk reading the book. And this was his big argument against Maria Montessori, and he wrote a book Kilpatrick did attacking Montessori, because Montessori trained the kids to read independently, think independently, work independently, and develop into thinkers, autonomously able to run their own lives. And Kilpatrick and the progressives wanted them to not to be dependent, on the state, not to be independent thinkers. And if you want to undermine somebody's ability to think independently, it's very logical that you would not want them reading at an early age. You'd want them reading later on in their life, if at all. And so that's the motivation. And Dewey's very explicit about it in his writings. That's his motivation for not wanting the kids to be taught to read by phonics. It works too well.
Not sometimes, every time I post something to the effect of what you just said on the internet, particularly on Twitter, and I say something to the effect of, your children are struggling to read by design. The people who founded the education system that your children go through did not want your children to be adept readers.
That's right.
There's always people in the comments saying, you conspiracy theorists, there's no way that's true. That's just propaganda and nonsense and fear mongering. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, you want me to read the quotes from Dewey?
If you have them there, let's do it.
Yeah, hold on.
I've definitely pulled these too.
Yeah, let me turn on the lamp here, because it's getting dark in the New York area. It's it's 5 o'clock. It's one thing I hate most about winter, and it's not even the colder climate. It's when it gets dark at 5 o'clock. I just hate it, But anyhow.
Yeah, I'm all about fall when it's getting chilly and you can wear more layers and you can pull out all the clothes that you haven't seen in months. It's great. And then it starts getting dark at 5 p.m. and it's really sad.
Yeah, I agree. Here's a quote from Dewey in his influential book, The School and Society. Quote, "The mere absorbing of facts and truths is so exclusively individual an affair that it tends very naturally to pass into selfishness. There is no obvious social motive for the acquirement of mere learning. There is no clear social gain in success thereat." Unquote from John Dewey. Now, he wrote a number of works on education. Experience in Education, his essay, My Pedagogic Creed. Now, in them, he made clear that the purpose of education is not to transmit, quote, bodies of information and skills that have been worked out in the past, quote, not to teach children science nor literature, not to teach children, quote, science nor literature nor history nor geography, unquote, but rather to prime them for, quote, social cooperation and community life, unquote. So, now here's me writing. Dewey put his fame and influence behind the idea that schools should train children to fit into the social system rather than to learn intellectual content and think independently. You don't want the kids to think independently, then you have to reject phonics.
We have to talk about that first quote because, and I've heard it before, but it gets me.
Every time, I know.
How can you argue that there's no social benefit to kids learning how to read and absorb information independently? Because the evidence to me feels so clearly to the opposite. That, again, what I said earlier, so many of the people who I have met over the years who are founders and builders and entrepreneurs, they're all readers because that's part of what empowers the thing that they're able to do. They're curious people, so they're absorbing information, but this information that they consume is what allows them to have the creative ideas that become the foundations of their companies, that become often things that are beneficial to many of us. And that is so obviously a social good that there's a completely different definition of, not even definition of terms, but complete framework of the moral hierarchy of reality to think that students not learning how to read is somehow socially beneficial.
No, I'm sorry for laughing. This is evil, but you're absolutely right. if you want real social progress, progress in literature, in painting, in music, in theoretical science, in medicine, in mathematics, in agriculture, in one of a million different fields, then, you need to train the mind. These are works of genius. The people like some of these great geniuses in American history, Edison and the Wright brothers and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe, and any field you want to mention, these are brilliant minds who are well educated. Even if like Thomas Edison, I think his schooling ended in the fourth grade. It reminded me of that line attributed to Mark Twain that I never let my schooling interfere with my education. But he was an autodidact. He was reading. He was a strong reader, and he's reading on his own. So if you want real progress in society that raises living standards, that increases life expectancies, that makes people's lives more comfortable, that gives you great advances in the arts and in every other field. And let's not forget the film industry. Born in the United States, turn of the 20th century. If you want all these kinds of advances that make human life better, then the kids need to learn how to read. The kids need to learn how to think. The kids need content. Absolutely. But if that's not your idea of social progress, or if that's not your idea of benefit to society, if your idea of benefit to society is to establish a communist state, in which the kids are taught not to pursue their own happiness, that's selfish, but to serve the state, then you don't want them thinking independently or being strong readers. And I'm going to give you the two facts that come to mind, one from 100 years ago and one from today. John Dewey, William Hurt Kilpatrick, George Counts, a number of people from Columbia. Again, Dewey's in the philosophy department, but these others who were influenced by Dewey were at Teachers College. Where did they pilgrimage to find the educational system that they admired and respected? They pilgrimaged to the Soviet Union in the 1920s under Joseph Stalin and came back with glowing reports of Soviet education, because Soviet education trained the kids to serve the state, not to pursue their own happiness. So, that's an enormous, I'm going to say red flag, literally a red flag. But another piece of evidence for this from like last year, I saw this, somebody posted on Facebook this essay from The Guardian. Now, The Guardian's a leftist newspaper in Great Britain, a very leftist newspaper in Great Britain. And it was really puzzling at first because the writer was talking about book ownership, having your own books, having your own personal library as a fetish. And it seems self-evidently good to me that people have a library, they read books, they show their kids, like you were saying before, they show their kids that they're reading books, and the kids grow up to, want to read books. But the writer was saying, and the language that she was using, made it sound like having your own personal library or some kind of weird thing. That's not something desirable. And so I'm thinking about that, and then I finally realized what's going on here. And that is, if you don't want people to read effectively, if you don't want them to be strong readers, why? Because strong readers will be independent thinkers, and they might question or challenge the edicts laid down by the wise rulers of the state. And you don't want that. You want them to obey the state. So even to the point where now they're haranguing against having books in your own home, having your own personal library. Well, it makes sense. It's very logical. If you're on that Platonic conceit that the wise, educated elite, they know how to run my life better than I do, and they know how to run my child's life better than I do. You can see why Hillary Clinton was frustrated. She called us a bunch of deplorables, because all we have to do is obey. Just obey the wise rulers of the state, and we'll have this very comfortable and peaceful, socialist society. But you American people, you're so obdurate, you're so stubborn on this. You have this stupid idea that you know how to run your life better than we do. And she was frustrated. She called it a basket of deplorables. She called most of the American people. Yeah, it's understandable from those premises, from those Platonic premises. Yeah, you don't want them to have books in their home. They'll be reading, they'll be thinking. They'll think independently. They'll challenge the wise rulers of the state. That's why Arthur Gates at Columbia and those guys at Teachers College militated against phonics. What you said is right, absolutely right. Even if people don't understand it and they think you're wacky, they're wrong. You're correct on this. Let me say one last thing, Hannah. They may be innocent people, and you can't get your head around it. Why would professional educators not want kids to read? It's so monstrous. Good people, it's hard for us to get our heads around that kind of motivation. You realize that, that most professional educators, not all, but most, are so far to the left politically that, they'd rather have a communist system than a free society.
I want to dig into what you just said for a moment because I want to get really clear about this. When you say professional educators, do you mean the average public school teacher, or do you mean the architects of the system and the methodologies that are being used in the classroom? Because in my experience, most educators that I've met, most, boots on the ground teacher in front of a classroom educator, are frustrated by the limitations of the system and want the best for the kids. They love books and want the kids to learn how to love reading books too. It feels to me, in my experience, that it's mostly the architects of the system who are to blame for this. But when you say educators, who are you referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Hannah. To clarify, I'm going to go back to what I said before. There's still, even today, there's many, many, many really good classroom teachers in the public school system who care about the kids' education. They want the kids to read. They smuggle in phonics. They're frustrated by having to fight against the stifling bureaucracy. And there's a lot of teacher burnout. A lot of times, the best teachers get burned out and they'll quit, or they'll go teach in a private school, or they'll hire themselves out as a tutor, or they'll move into another profession altogether.
I met one this weekend who's now in construction, couldn't take it anymore.
I absolutely right. And then the kids, through no fault of their own, are denied access to some of the best teachers. No, the horror comes first, foremost, and always from the teacher colleges. Who, what was his name? Arthur Bestor. He was a professor of American history, 1950s, wrote a book called Educational Wastelands. This goes back 70 years. And Bestor talked about what he called the interlocking directorate. Right, a directorate is a group of people of power. Interlocking obviously means they're coupled together. Who holds the power in the American school system? And Professor Bestor pointed out the teachers' colleges, the state departments of education, the federal departments of education. These are the power brokers in the American school system, and these are the ones who are responsible for for this mess. Not the poor classroom teachers, who have to deal with the stifling bureaucracy, which is why I mentioned Marva Collins before. One of the finest teachers this country ever produced. She left the public school system. She didn't have a teaching degree, by the way, so she was not as permeated with the poison that they swill out in the teachers' colleges. And she left the public school system in Chicago, founded West Side Prep, used phonics, and those kids that a lot of kids from the ghetto, or from slum neighborhoods, a lot of minority kids that the public school system deemed ineducable. Marva Collins taught them. They became very strong readers, and they tested very well. They went on to college, went on to successful careers. It really shows what a good teacher can do for you. But you had to leave the school system and found West Side Prep, a small private school, starting in like somebody's basement or something like that, and got West Side Prep off the ground. But there's still a lot of good classroom teachers. And here's a piece of good news about that, Hannah, and everybody out there, is what they call micro schools. And very often you find some teacher who's disgruntled with the school system, and some parents who are disgruntled, usually a woman, can be a man, but I think a lot of times is your stereotypical school marm, who's strict with the kids, but really cares about their education. Really, I had teachers like that in first grade. They were all women, and they were strict, but you could tell, looking back on it, they cared about our education. And to your point, what you said before, I remember one of my elementary school teachers say, always have a book with you. Carry a paperback, whatever it is. If it's a thriller or a love story or a serious literature, whatever it is, carry a paperback with you and read. And, and I had a lot of teachers like that. And so you have this, the school, the micro school, you have your school mom generally, sometimes a man though, and you have a school set up in somebody's basement, and you have, I don't know, four, five families, six families, whatever, 8, 10 kids, different grades. It's like the old, one room schoolhouse. But now you have a teacher who doesn't have to deal with the stifling bureaucracy. The parents want academic training for the kids. The parents want phonics to teach reading. And the teacher now, she's strict with the kids, but she cares about them, and she educates them, and it's Forbes magazine did a story on this a year or two ago, about the return of the one-room schoolhouse. And I think this is a big step forward for the future of American education. It's really good news.
I agree completely. And I've had many people on the show who are involved in the micro school movement in some capacity, either in some ways supporting it behind the scenes, advocating for it, running micro schools themselves. It's a very exciting thing to me because it brings the education back to the community where it should be, not just the delivery of the education, but the decisions made about the education. And you get to choose the community that you're engaging with for the education of your child. You're not just assigned a district, you get to pick your micro school, but you also have access to a wealth of tools and information and resources that did not exist when one room schoolhouses originally proliferated the nation. And so you're able to deliver a level of education that in the history of humanity has never before been accessible. And that's extremely exciting. I think there's a lot of potential there. You, in your book title, have an optimistic spin on everything. You talk about why Johnny still can't read or write or understand math. But then in the end, you add, but here's what we can do about it. And I wanna close out by talking about the positive sides of this. Like we've talked about how poor the reading rates are. I haven't even mentioned this yet, but I was talking on Twitter yesterday about the enrollment rates for remedial reading and mathematics courses in universities. I didn't realize it's as poor as it is. I think it's 68% of students in community colleges are enrolled in at least one remedial course, and 40% of students in public four-year universities are enrolled in remedial courses. That is an insane number. It's really bad out there, and remedial courses in college are not the answer, but you do talk about what we can do about how we can fix this. I'm going to ask you this question in two parts. The first part is, on a societal level, what are the biggest things that would make the biggest difference, besides obviously reintroducing phonics into reading education? What are the biggest things that would make a difference in our students' test scores and the abilities that those scores reflect? But then perhaps more importantly, what are the biggest things that parents can do with their own children to combat the shortcomings and even the downward moving inertia of the school system that their kids maybe can't fully escape from, but that parents can combat on their own?
Right. And again, before we get started, we always stress first, foremost, and always parents using phonics to teach their kids how to read. What we said before, show the young children that the books are fun, so the kid's motivated to read. And then by age 4 or 5, use systematic phonics, teach the kid how to read. That's a fundamental step right there. Societal level, you asked. We need to phase out the public school system. This is an ideal to be worked towards. It's not practicable in our day, but we can work towards phasing out the school system, privatizing the education system in this country like it was prior to the mid 19th century. My good friend, Brad Thompson at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism calls himself an abolitionist. I call him the William Lloyd Garrison of the modern, abolish the school system movement. Yeah, that's an ideal to work towards. All schooling could be private. What we'll see then is a rise in homeschooling. We'll see more micro schools, which are really just small community schools. We'll see a rise in the hiring of tutors for the kids. Like Brad Thompson said to me, he said every church in the country we'll start a small, every church, every synagogue in the country will have a small private school, and education will be more diverse. And these smaller schools will proliferate across the country, and the education levels, I think, will go way up. But the second part of your question is something we can do right now. Parent power is the answer here. We need to recognize parents need to step up. I know they're tired after working all day and feeding the kids and make sure the kids are well rested and well clothed. I get it. It's they're working, they're tiring. But this is their children, and it's their children's education. We can't leave it to the schools. The schools are miserable, and there's no way to fix them. It's simply hopeless. But parents can step up. Parents can, teach the kids how to read. Parents could do a lot of, what they call after schooling, work with the kids after school and on their homework. Parents can hire tutors. I'm a tutor. And tutors are really good, Hannah, because think about this. First of all, they have the technology. So you could be a family in Illinois, let's say, and you want to hire somebody to teach biology to your students. So you find, whether through LinkedIn or various websites, varsitytutors.com, whatever, you find some graduate student at the University of Oregon who has a bachelor's degree in biology. Unlike the high school teachers who most generally have a degree in education, and they haven't taken as many biology courses in college, as the grad student has, who has a bachelor's degree in biology. And that's one of the problems. The teachers have to go through education classes. So the future English teachers are taking fewer English courses than your garden variety English majors, and your future math teachers are taking fewer math courses, and they don't know that much English or math. Anyhow, I had an anecdote for you if you have the time for it. But so you hire this kid, graduate student at the University of Oregon. You do it via Zoom. He or she's already got a bachelor's degree in biology, so already he's taken more bio classes than high school teachers have. Now he's in graduate school, so he's taking further, classes in biology, knows the subject better. Furthermore, he's a graduate student. He's poor. You could hire him for $40 an hour, or something. It's good for him. His teaching experience goes on his resume. If he does a good job, the parents give him a strong recommendation. When I was in grad school, I had to run from one school to another as an adjunct. You don't have to do that anymore. You can tutor from your living room all over the world. So, and that way you get people who are more knowledgeable in their field than the teachers are. Let me give you an anecdote real quick. 1999, 2000, Cliff's Notes hired me to write the Cliff's Notes for 3 Ayn Rand titles: Anthem, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, books I love. And they told me, the chief editor told me, he said, when Cliff Notes started in the 1950s, 1960s, our main demographic were high school and college kids. Today, by 2000, our main demographic are high school English teachers, because they didn't once in a while they're assigned to to teach, Jane Eyre or, A Tale of Two Cities or King Lear or whatever it is. And either they never read it when they were in college because they were taking education courses rather than literature courses, or worse, Hannah, they don't understand it. And so they need Cliff Notes to be able to teach the kids. That's how bad it is, because the teachers aren't learning their subject matters. They're taking education courses. So that's why hiring tutors who are grad students is good for everybody. There's a whole bunch of things. Homeschooling has risen. It's really effective. In some states, there's homeschool co-ops where parents can teach each other's kids, which is really good. The micro schools are really good. Tutors are really good. There's all kinds of steps, that we can take to improve education of our kids right now, today. Parent power is the answer. Parents have to take control. Parents need to control the content and the methods by which their children are taught, not the government.
There's a company called Curious Cardinals. I had the founder, Audrey Wish, on the podcast maybe a year ago, and they do what you're describing. They connect college students with various areas of specialty, depending on their major, with kids. The tutoring, I believe it's K-12, but I think they work with kids at all different ages. Mm-hmm. They'll connect them with a tutor who's a college student who's, has lots of subject matter expertise, but not necessarily a ton of money and market value yet. So they're working at affordable rates and they're practicing their subject matter by teaching it to kids. And it's a really cool model. Kids will be paired with different tutors for different subjects sometimes. For parents who are listening to this and are interested in that sort of model of education, I would highly recommend checking that out. There's a podcast episode, or you can just check out Curious Cardinals.
Yeah.
Andrew,
Yeah.
where would you send people next if they have enjoyed this interview? Obviously, your book, I highly recommend. It's a phenomenal read. It's
Yeah,
really
thank you. It is.
engaging. I read it pretty much cover to cover when I sat down to read it the first time. It's honestly a page turn. Really good.
Thank you, Hannah.
Where else would you send people to find more of your work, or where would you send them next to learn more about what we've been talking about?
Well, for me personally, they can go to my website, which is andrewbernstein.net, and all the different books I published, fiction, nonfiction, and and so on. andrewbernstein.net. If they want more information on education, the things we're talking about, a lot of it's in the in this book, in the bibliography and everything here. One really good book for homeschoolers, Jessica Wise, Susan Wise Bauer. You're probably familiar with the book, Hannah. The Will Trade Mind is very, very good book for micro schools and homeschooling. There's so many websites you could go to. The homeschoolmom.com, microschoolrevolution.com, outschool.com, varsitytutors.com. I probably went too fast, but you could get a copy of this book. I don't know. Amazon sells it inexpensively. I forget what it is, $15-20. All that information is in the book and in the bibliography for people who want to homeschool or want to hire tutors or want to look for micro schools in their area.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been really fun.
Oh, it's always good talking to you, Hannah. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. We'll talk more soon.
Yes.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.